Hey class, today we're going to talk about exercise in hot and cold environments as well as at altitude. So I'm going to kind of move through some of these slides. If I go spend more time on others than some, that just means, there's some key points that I really want to make sure we take home with this lecture. So normal body temperatures, or core temperature, is about 37 degrees Celsius and is regulated by our pre-optic anterior hypothalamus, okay, which is our body's thermostat. Our core temperature doesn't change before our kind of skin temperature, so we'll actually, it kind of works from like the outside in, right? So once we start to sense that change in temperature kind of through the skin, which is through these sensory receptors, we have peripheral thermoreceptors, and then eventually we will have central thermoreceptors that come in through the brain and spinal cord that say, hey, we need to cool ourselves down. And the main mechanism by which we cool ourselves down is through sweating. So the POAH signals the sympathetic nervous system. We end up having vasoconstriction in order to minimize heat loss, but when we're talking about a hot environment, we see vasodilation, and then we see sweat come from the main sweat glands, which are going to be our eccrine sweat glands. So there's other ways in which we can maintain our body's core temperature. There's skeletal muscle effectors. We generate heat by shivering. We have endocrine gland factors. Metabolic rate goes up. We increase heat production. Thyroxine is going to increase that metabolic rate. So don't worry too much about that. The stress of physical exertion complicates environmental thermal conditions. So humans were homeothermic, which means our internal body temperature is regulated nearly constant despite environmental temperature changes. And the ways that we end up creating heat production within the body is typically we have that metabolic heat, right? A lot of it's going to come from basically metabolic heat when we think of it as if you were to land from a jump. Okay, a lot of that work or a lot of that energy actually dissipates as heat, okay, and only about 25% is actually stored and used as mechanical work or energy. So in order for ourselves to cool ourselves or to heat us up, okay, we see a transfer of heat between the body and the environment. So we have heat gain through metabolic heat, environmental heat, and then heat loss through radiation, conduction, convection, and then evaporation, with us focusing a lot on evaporation today. So conduction is heat transfer from one solid material to another. So think when you sit on a cold bench, right, you're now transferring your heat to the cold bench. And then convection is movement of air or liquid across the surface. So think of when you are pumping your arms, okay, and you feel kind of cooled down a little bit. That's the convection idea. And then radiation is heat loss from infrared rays. We use this primarily at rest. You can give off or receive radiant heat. And then evaporation, that's going to be heat loss via phase change from liquid to gas. Our sweat is liquid, and then we end up cooling ourselves as that sweat ends up evaporating. However, there is clothing that makes us resistant to evaporation. So here's just a little Tommy sitting there. You can see some examples of evaporation, radiation, convection, and conduction. Right? Another example in which we are producing heat, absorbing heat, so on and so forth with this football player. So if we look at this, start talking about exercise within a humid or a dry environment. Exercise in a humid environment is going to be essential to replace that water loss because we're going to sweat, but that sweat is not going to evaporate, meaning we're not going to cool ourselves down in a humid environment. However, when we are in a hot, dry environment, the sweat is able to evaporate and cool ourselves down. So with humidity, like I said, we decrease evaporation, but if we decrease the humidity, we can increase the evaporation. And so that's that cooling capacity of sweat. As we exercise, we see an increase in metabolic heat load. So this disturbs thermal homeostasis. Again, now we have to dissipate that internal heat, right? So our skin arterioles vasodilate. Okay, this is going to end up increasing convection, heat loss, and requires kind of an increased blood flow. So the POAH will also trigger the SNS to increase cardiac output, okay, further via increasing the heart rate contractility, and will vasoconstrict to non-essential tissues. Blood volume from sweat will go down. Stroke volume can't really increase, so heart rate increases. That compensates, and that's that cardiovascular drift that we talked about in the last module. So here's just to show you in terms of temperature what happens with heart rate, cardiac output, as well as stroke volume. So sweating is the main way in which we actually cool the body. How sweat works, what we see here is an eccrine gland. What we have are blood vessels or capillaries that come across right here at the coil aspect of it. We have, when we start to sweat or exercise in a hotter environment, or even sweat and exercise in general, and we need to sweat to cool our body's internal temperature, there's vasodilation, so blood flow goes to the capillaries. These capillaries within the blood, right, we have plasma volume that's made up of water, sodium, certain things like that. We have sodium that gets released into these coils. Because of osmosis, water is going to follow, and then as we travel up this duct, we're going to see sodium get reabsorbed, and we're going to see the majority of our sweat be water. So training effects, typically as we become more trained, we are more sensitive to aldosterone. Okay, we conserve more sodium. If we are not well trained, a lot of our sweat now it'll be saltier, so there's more sodium chloride. We can lose up to about 1.6, 2.0 liters, or about 3% of our body weight, and be okay. We don't want to continue to lose that each hour, but we'll be all right if we're in that general area, but making sure that we are hydrating as well, because we end up seeing an increase in sweating, decreased blood volume, decreased cardiac output. That's going to lead to severe dehydration and also impaired performance. So here's that heat loss, right? We have the vasodilation. You can see constriction there, dilation here. Now there's blood flow here, and now we can have sweat, and then that sweat can now evaporate. So why do we hydrate? Well, it's a medium for transportation, diffusion, regulates temperature as well as our blood pressure, and improves performance. As you can see, running velocity, someone who is hydrated versus unhydrated will run a lot faster. We do need to be on a lookout. So we have heat cramps, which can be triggered by dehydration. Okay, there's usually sodium loss. This is typically a little bit more common in heavy sweaters. Another health risk would be heat exhaustion. Okay, this could be caused by severe dehydration. And now what we end up seeing is pulse will become extremely rapid, dizzy, nausea, fainting will occur. And then we have heat stroke, which is the core temperature getting above 40 degrees Celsius, and this is more life-threatening. You guys can kind of see, right, as we get towards heat stroke, okay, there's a cessation of sweating. Okay, you might start getting the chills or goosebumps with heat exhaustion, so be on the lookout if you're ever around athletes that are suffering from these signs and symptoms. So again, just to show you in terms of running time, those that are intaking fluids versus those that are not intaking fluids. We can become acclimated to exercise in the heat. Okay, so acclimation is within 9 to 14 days. Acclimatization is months or years. So our cardiovascular system becomes optimized. Our sweating rate, distribution, and content changes. Like I said, untrained individuals has more salt, sodium chloride, and someone who is more well-trained is more sensitive to aldosterone and is able to have their sweat be more hypotonic, or basically there's just more water. So what we end up seeing with acclimation to exercise is that we see plasma volume increase due to an increase in oncotic pressure. So basically we're pulling in water from different spaces, from extracellular fluid, intracellular spaces, and this helps us buy time for other adaptations to occur. As I said, if plasma volume at the initial onset of sweating, we can see plasma volume go down and heart rate would go up, but eventually, again, this increasing plasma volume. It's amazing what our body does. Gives us time for our heart rate to decrease and increase our cardiac output. And then we'll end up seeing actually widespread sweating earlier as well, which ends up being more dilute, which prevents the dangerous sodium loss, and more sweating on our arms and our legs. So here's just to show you the difference between trained and untrained men and women in terms of sweat content, temperature, heart rate, and then here we can see acclimation, hourly sweat rate, final heart rate, so on and so forth, after about 10 days of exercise. So exercise in the cold, okay, again, POAH is going to now trigger vasoconstriction because we don't want to lose heat, we want to gain heat. One way in which we end up maintaining heat is through goosebumps. The hair stands straight up. Okay, we shiver, we have vasoconstriction to the skin, increased metabolic rate, so even going up to the mountains somewhere cold, our metabolic rate goes up, and increase in stroke volume. So here's just to show you kind of, guys, the process in which everything happens, right? Skeletal muscles shiver, blood vessels vasoconstrict, okay, we see an increased metabolic rate, increased blood glucose secretion, and again, so all of these adrenal medulla, cortex, and the thyroid glands increasing that metabolic rate. So there's more glucose utilization and glycogen depletion. Here's just another chart to show you guys what shivering does. Obviously, remember, shivering, when our muscles contract, causes that muscle pump, okay, which increases stroke volume, cardiac output. And then you can see these other hormones, okay, as well as neurotransmitters that increase metabolism and utilization of certain substrates. So now we can get even colder. There's that idea of that wind chill. Okay, you get even colder in the water. So heat loss increases in moving water. Okay, and so we would want to make sure that if we're in cold water, we are moving and gaining heat. Okay, so there's the wind chill effect, as I mentioned already. Got to be on the lookout for hypothermia. Typically, we don't see crazy issues with breathing in cold air unless it gets below, I'll go to the slide, okay, below 10 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, we do see that heart rate starts to slow a little bit, ventilation goes down as well in cold environments, muscle function goes down. Okay, this is why a proper warm-up in a cold environment is essential. We can see body composition effects that affect heat loss. So again, pretty much the bigger that we are, the more fat that someone has, okay, the more insulation, okay, and the less heat loss. Okay, if we have a decreased body surface area to mass ratio, we decrease heat loss. So what we end up seeing is that larger individuals have a smaller surface area to mass ratio. So older individuals lose overall muscle mass, decreasing tissue insulation. Kids have large surface area to mass ratio, meaning they have greater heat loss. Okay, and then for men versus women, women have more subcutaneous fat, which is an advantage, but less active muscle, which is a disadvantage. So we can get used to being in the cold, right? We can have cold habituation, metabolic acclimation, and insulative acclimation. And that is all she wrote.